Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Billy had lived his whole life believing that he knew exactly who he was, that the messy puzzle pieces of his past, his addictions, his failures, his grudges, his endless wars with Victor Newman, were part of a larger design meant to keep him defined as John Abbott's son, the perpetual black sheep of the Abbott clan, the man who could never measure up to Jack, the man who always seemed destined to fall into one self-destructive cycle after another, but everything shattered into unrecognizable fragments the moment the DNA envelope hit the table in the Newman boardroom, a manila folder that Nick reluctantly slid across with eyes heavy with unspoken dread, because for weeks now whispers had built into storms that Billy had been the product of a long-buried secret affair, and when the results finally came back, there it was, bold, cold, scientific letters that could not be erased, rewritten, or fought away with Abbott pride. Victor Newman, 99.99% probability father, and for one fleeting second Billy thought it was a cruel prank, another manipulative Newman trick to make him feel small, but then he saw the raw tension in Nikki's hands as she clutched her pearls, the storm in Victoria's face as she tried to shield herself from a revelation that shifted her entire world, the fire in Nick's jaw as he clenched his teeth, furious that his father had yet another child tangled in the fabric of Genoa City, and suddenly Billy's legs felt like lead, his mouth dry, his heart racing in a rhythm that did not feel like his own, because all those years of hating Victor, of plotting against him, of vowing never to bow down to Newman power, meant nothing now that biology had tethered them in ways neither had ever anticipated, and Victor himself, the seemingly unshakable titan of business and family, stood in rare silence, his steely eyes softening as if he too was transported back decades to a reckless mistake or a night of passion that had created a life he had never acknowledged. And as Billy's knees buckled, as the fury and the confusion fought with the strange pang of longing in his chest, something inside him broke open like floodgates, not anger this time, but grief for the father he thought he had known, grief for the years of battles fought against a man who, unbeknownst to either of them, shared his blood, his stubbornness, his ruthless will to survive, and the tears came hot and fast before he could stop them, shocking the room into utter silence, and then, in the most un-Billy Abbott move imaginable, he stumbled forward and collapsed into Victor's arms, clutching the man he had once sworn to destroy, sobbing against the iron chest of the enemy who was now his father, and for a moment Victor, stunned, kept his arms stiff, but then, slowly, almost painfully, he wrapped them around Billy, one strong hand bracing the back of his son's head, his face unreadable yet his eyes betraying a glimmer of moisture that no Newman would ever admit to shedding, and Nicky gasped, Victoria trembled, Jack, if he had been present, would have exploded, but the truth hung heavier than any rivalry. Billy was not just an Abbott anymore, he was a Newman, and the embrace was less reconciliation than raw survival, two men broken by destiny, bound now in a way no feud could sever, and the boardroom, normally a place of ruthless decisions, became a cathedral of unspoken prayers, because for all the power plays, for all the corporate wars, this was the ultimate plot twist, one that would redefine not just Billy's identity, but the future of both dynasties, and as Billy clung tighter, whispering through sobs that he didn't know how to hate a man who was suddenly his father, Victor only muttered, "We will figure this out, my son," words that cracked the world wide open, sending shockwaves through the very foundations of Genoa City, and though the storm was only beginning, Jack's rage, Jill's heartbreak, Ashley's disbelief, Victoria's fury, the seed had been planted, the fragile, trembling seed of a father and son bond that no one had ever seen coming, and in that one embrace, Billy lost and found himself all at once, his tears a baptism, his hug an unthinkable truce, his life forever rewritten by the DNA that had turned enemies into blood, rivals into kin, and history into something no one could ever undo. Billy's body trembled as if the weight of decades of resentment had suddenly become too heavy to carry, and in Victor's embrace he felt a disorienting mix of warmth, fear, and betrayal, his entire sense of identity crumbling like brittle glass in the presence of the one man he had always sworn was the enemy, the manipulator, the tyrant who destroyed lives with the flick of his pen or the thunder of his voice. Yet here he was, trembling like a child, clinging to the chest of a man who was not just his adversary but his father, his blood, his mirror in ways he never wanted to admit, and around them the silence was thick, broken only by the muffled sound of Billy's sobs, which carried the pain of a lifetime of searching for approval, of longing for belonging, of trying desperately to prove himself to John Abbott's memory, to Jack, to Jill, to everyone who doubted him, and now every battle, every drink, every self-sabotage suddenly seemed like a misguided attempt to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside him that perhaps only the truth could ever fill, and though his mind screamed that this was madness, that no DNA test should ever undo the history of cruelty Victor had inflicted on him, his heart, the traitorous heart that yearned for fatherly love he had never truly known, betrayed him with each tear and each desperate grip on Victor's tailored jacket, as if he were afraid the man might vanish and take with him the answers Billy had been unconsciously seeking all along, and Victor, for all his legendary stoicism, for all the decades of presenting himself as unyielding steel, felt the fragility of the moment burn through his armor, for in Billy's tears he glimpsed echoes of his own long-buried regrets, of children lost, estranged, or scarred by the very empire he had built, and though Victor had no script for this kind of reckoning, no calculated strategy to wield, he allowed instinct, human instinct, paternal instinct, to guide him, his arms tightening slightly, his chin lowering as if to shield his newly revealed son from the judging stares of everyone else in the room. And Nikki, her own heart split between outrage and compassion, whispered Victor's name with trembling disbelief, as though saying it aloud might shatter the surreal illusion that had fallen over them, while Victoria's eyes filled with fire, her entire body coiled like a spring about to snap, because the revelation that Billy was her half-brother reframed every intimate moment, every fight, every reconciliation, every love and heartbreak they had shared, turning it all into a twisted labyrinth of family tragedy that she could not yet process, and Nick, caught between fury at his father's endless betrayals and horror at the way the Abbott-Newman lines were now blurred beyond recognition, slammed his fist against the table, his voice breaking as he demanded to know how Victor could let something like this remain hidden for so long, but Victor only held Billy tighter, as if in this one fragile act of acceptance he might atone for 1,000 past sins, and Billy, overwhelmed, whispered words no one expected, not even himself, "All my life I hated you, and now I don't even know how," a confession that cracked Victor's expression for the briefest second, his jaw tightening as moisture pricked at the edges of his eyes, though he quickly blinked it away, unwilling to show weakness, yet unable to deny the rush of paternal instinct coursing through him, and as the boardroom vibrated with shockwaves, the reverberations of this revelation rippled outward across Genoa city like aftershocks of an earthquake, because outside this room were people whose lives would never be the same, Jill for one, the mother who had raised Billy with fierce if flawed love, who would be forced to confront her past with brutal honesty, remembering the nights she had buried her shame, the lies she had told to protect her son, the truth she had tried to outrun but could no longer keep hidden, and Jack, oh Jack, who had built his very soul on being the true heir to John Abbott's legacy, who had endured Billy's failures, picked him up when he fell, condemned him when he strayed, all under the assumption that they shared not only brotherhood but blood, and when the news reached him, when he realized that Billy was no Abbott at all, the rage and betrayal would consume him in ways even Victor could not have orchestrated, while Ashley, always torn between loyalty to family and suspicion of truth, would feel her world tilt as she tried to reconcile the idea that the brother she had alternately protected and chastised was, in fact, the son of the man she herself had often clashed with, and then there was Adam, who would smirk with poisonous satisfaction at the irony of it all, relishing the chaos that had suddenly made Billy less Abbott and more Newman, imagining the ways he could exploit this DNA shock to his own advantage, perhaps even forging an alliance with a man who once despised him but now shared the same paternal shadow, and Chelsea, forever tethered to Billy through history and heartbreak, would find herself questioning whether she could look him in the eye knowing his bloodline had shifted so drastically, while Phyllis, ever the instigator, would seize on this revelation with gleeful venom, using it to stir up Jack's insecurities, Victor's pride, and Billy's fragile psyche, because in Genoa City secrets were weapons, and this one was nuclear, yet in that moment, in that boardroom, none of those external explosions mattered to Billy, because all he could feel was the strange, terrible comfort of his enemy's arms, the first embrace that felt both alien and necessary, as if destiny had been guiding him here all along, and though his tears stained Victor's suit, he did not let go, because letting go would mean returning to the chaos of identities shattered, rivalries reignited, and futures uncertain, while staying pressed against the man he once swore to destroy allowed him, for just a few heartbeats, to imagine that he was not lost after all, that he had been found, even if the price of being found was to unravel everything he had ever believed about himself, about his family, about the war between Abbots and Newmans, and as Victor murmured again, softer this time, "We will figure this out, my son," the words echoed like a vow, a promise not only to Billy but to himself, that no matter how the world reacted, no matter how Jack or Jill or Victoria exploded, he would not deny this child, not again, not ever, because for all his faults, all his sins, Victor Newman would not turn his back on blood, and Billy, still weeping, still shaking, held tighter, whispering, "I don't know how to be your son, but I want to try," and in that confession lay the seeds of a storyline that would ignite wars, mend wounds, and destroy legacies, because nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same again. Jack Abbott's fury, when the revelation finally reached him, was like a detonation that echoed through the very walls of the Abbott mansion, because for Jack, family was not just a word but a creed, a sacred bond tethered to the memory of John Abbott, and to hear that Billy, the brother he had spent his life alternately protecting, chastising, rescuing, and resenting, was in fact not his brother at all but Victor Newman's son, was a betrayal of cosmic proportions, an insult that went deeper than any boardroom battle, deeper than any feud, because it was not simply about Billy's blood but about the desecration of John's legacy, the unraveling of the Abbott name, and Jack's voice cracked with rage as he pounded his fist against the mantel in the family living room, roaring that Victor had once again stolen something precious from him, this time not a company, not a lover, not dignity, but his very family, his brother, his partner in dysfunction, his flawed other half, and Jill, pale and trembling, stood helplessly across from him, tears streaking her cheeks as she tried to explain, to defend her long-buried choices, confessing in choked tones that decades ago she had been young, impulsive, vulnerable, that Victor's shadow had fallen across her life in a moment of weakness, that what happened was not planned but was real enough to create Billy, and though she had loved John and had loved the Abbott name, she had hidden this truth because she wanted to spare Billy, to spare Jack, to spare them all from the carnage she knew it would unleash, but Jack would not hear it. He shouted that she had not spared them, she had doomed them, she had poisoned the Abbott family tree with lies, and worse, she had tied them to Victor, the man who had been their mortal enemy for decades, and in his fury Jack spat words that cut deeper than knives, declaring that Billy was no longer his brother, no longer an Abbott, no longer family, and the sound of those words, when Billy later heard them, would send him spiraling into a despair so profound it almost undid the fragile bond he had begun to build with Victor, because for Billy the one thing he feared more than being hated by Victor was being rejected by Jack, the man whose approval he had always sought, the man he had always wanted to measure up to, and now Jack's disavowal left him unmoored, dangling between two worlds, too much Abbott to walk away, too much Newman to deny the truth, and Jill, devastated by Jack's fury, sank to her knees in the Abbott mansion, sobbing that she had destroyed everything, that her choices had shattered both families, that she had no way to put the pieces back together, and as she cried, Catherine Chancellor's portrait seemed to gaze down with silent judgment, reminding Jill that secrets always had a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully buried. And across town Victoria was unraveling in her own storm, pacing her office at Newman Enterprises, her mind replaying every kiss, every embrace, every whispered word she had ever shared with Billy, and the bile rose in her throat as she realized that the man she had loved, the man she had forgiven, the father of her children's half-siblings, was also her half-brother, and the disgust, the horror, the fury twisted together until she slammed a glass against the wall, screaming that Victor had once again destroyed her life, her chance at normalcy, her ability to trust, and though Victor tried to reach her, to assure her that she and Billy had been victims of ignorance rather than willful wrongdoing, Victoria would not hear it. She declared that she would never forgive him, that every shred of loyalty she had left to her father was gone, and as she stormed out of Newman Enterprises, leaving shattered glass and stunned employees in her wake, she vowed to make both Victor and Billy pay. And her rage soon reached Nick, who, still furious in his own right, found himself torn between comforting his sister and fueling the fire of rebellion against their father, because Nick too could not ignore the irony that Billy, the man who had so often been a thorn in their side, was now one of them, and while part of him wanted to reject Billy outright, another part of him, the part softened by Sharon and faith in Christian, recognized the pain in Billy's eyes, the childlike longing that mirrored his own complicated history with Victor, and Nick, against his instincts, found himself offering Billy a rare olive branch, muttering that maybe they didn't have to be enemies anymore, that maybe sharing Victor's blood didn't have to be the curse it seemed, and that small flicker of acceptance gave Billy something to cling to, something to balance against the tidal wave of Jack's rejection, Jill's guilt, and Victoria's fury. Yet the turmoil was far from over, because Adam, ever the opportunist, saw the cracks in both families and seized the moment, smirking in smoky shadows as he whispered to Billy that perhaps this was his chance to stop playing second fiddle to Jack and instead rise as a Newman, to embrace the ruthless streak he had always tried to deny, to become not a pawn in Victor's empire but a prince in his own right. And though Billy recoiled at the suggestion, the seed was planted, the temptation lingered, because if Jack refused him, if Victoria disowned him, if Jill could not undo the past, perhaps the only place left for him to belong was by Victor's side, and Victor, shrewd as ever, recognized the vulnerability in his newly discovered son, the same vulnerability he had once exploited in Adam, the same hunger for validation that made his children both love him and hate him, and though he vowed to himself not to make the same mistakes again, not to let Billy be consumed by the fire of Newman ambition, Victor also knew that the world would not allow this revelation to exist without consequence, that the Abbott board would challenge Billy's claim to family ties, that the Newman children would fight tooth and nail to protect their shares, that the press, once they sniffed out the truth, would sensationalize every sordid detail, and in the quiet of his study, staring at the portrait of himself that hung above the fireplace, Victor whispered that this war was only beginning, that blood had bound them, but survival would test them, and as Billy sat alone that night in Chancellor Park, the autumn wind rattling the leaves, he whispered to the ghost of John Abbott, apologizing, begging for forgiveness, confessing that he didn't know how to honor a man who might not have been his father but was still the one who had shaped his conscience, his values, his idea of family, and the tears came again, hot and bitter, because though DNA had rewritten the past, Billy's heart still ached for the father who raised him, the brother who now hated him, the family that might never claim him again. And as the night deepened, he looked toward Newman Tower's glowing lights and murmured to himself that he would not let this destroy him, that he would find a way to reconcile both sides of himself, Abbott and Newman, even if it killed him, because perhaps only in the collision of those two legacies could Billy finally become whole, but what he could not yet know was that the choice he made in the coming weeks, whether to embrace Victor fully or reject him, would alter not just his future but the future of both dynasties, sending shockwaves through every family in Genoa City in ways no one could predict, ensuring that this DNA shock would not just be a twist but a saga that defined a generation. And yet the storm had only begun to gather, because Ashley, always the pragmatist with a scientist's eye for truth and a woman's heart forever scarred by Victor's betrayals, stood in her lab staring at the headlines she knew would soon come crashing down, whispering to herself that Jill's secret had detonated a bomb bigger than anything they had endured in decades. And though she told herself she had no reason to care whether Billy was Abbott or Newman, the truth carved into her like a knife. Because for all his faults, for all his relapses and screw-ups, Billy had always been her little brother, the boy she once tried to shield from the harshness of the world, and now that tether was fraying, replaced by the unbearable thought that he was not hers to protect anymore, and when she finally confronted Jill, her voice was brittle but sharp, accusing Jill of destroying John Abbott's legacy, of desecrating the one thing Ashley still clung to, the pride of being John's daughter, and Jill, hollow-eyed and broken, could only whisper back that she had loved Billy with every fiber of her being, that blood or no blood he was still the boy she raised, but Ashley's glare said everything, that the betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw, the forgiveness too far away, and meanwhile Nicky, caught between the husband she loved and the wreckage he had created, paced the halls of the ranch, her mind flashing back to every time Victor had sworn there were no more secrets, no more lies, and yet here they were, trapped in another scandal that threatened not only their family's unity but their very sanity, and as she stared at Victor across their bedroom, her voice quivered with a mixture of anger and resignation as she told him that she had stood by him through countless affairs.